we'll get started. So I want to welcome everyone to the Farnsworth Art Museum's lecture by Chief Curator Michael Komanecky on Robert Indiana's Hartley Elegies. We're so happy to have you with us today. My name is Gwendolyn Loomis-Smith. I'm the Phyllis Wyeth Director of Learning and Engagement here at Farnsworth. And to tell you a little bit about Michael Komanecky, our Chief Curator, has been with us at the Farnsworth Art Museum since 2007. He has curated numerous exhibitions in the time since at the Farnsworth, ranging from Slab City Rendezvous to the Shakers, from Mount Lebanon to the world. He's currently working at an exhibition that will debut next year at Farnsworth. It's called A Maynard Goes West, William Herbert Buck Dunton, and that's going to be here next year. And Buck Dunton's dates, just in case you're wondering, 1878 to 1936, so that should definitely be a good show to watch out for. Prior to Farnsworth, Michael has served as a curator or in directorial capacities at various museums, including Courier Gallery of Art, Phoenix Art Museum, Dayton Art Institute, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Yale University Art Gallery. Michael has also worked on a number of publications, quite numerous actually, including Robert Indiana and the Star of Hope, as well as At First Light, 2 Centuries of Maine Artists and Their Homes. And Michael has also most recently written and championed the production of Maine and American Art. That is the Farnsworth Art Museum's Catalog of American Art in Maine, or Maine Artists, that actually debuted last year in 2020 from Rizzoli. And after Michael's lecture, as I mentioned, we'll have time to answer any questions you may have about the talk today on Robert Indiana and the Hartley Elegy. So if you have any questions, just kindly put them in the Q&A box, which is actually at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to pull those out of the Q&A box and talk with Michael about them. So thanks again for joining, and without any further ado, I present Michael Komanecky.
Thanks, Gwen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to jump right into this to share with you some thoughts about an exhibition that's currently up at the Farnsworth Art Museum called Robert Indiana, the Hartley Elegies. So to come back to this group of works, they're an elegy. It's a commemoration to Marsden Hartley, an artist who was active in the early 20th century. And as I said, Indiana began a series of 18 paintings and then these 10 silkscreen prints on the subject of Marsden Hartley and Bob's relationship through a series of shared coincidences in their 2 lives. So here you see very quickly this group of 5 vertical silkscreen prints and 5 diamond-shaped prints that make up this Hartley Elegy series. Bob Indiana is one of America's foremost artists of the post-World War II period, and best known, of course, for his many iterations of love, sculpture, paintings, and prints. Here you see Bob standing before his home on the island of Vinalhaven at about the time he embarked on this series of works called the Hartley Elegies. And the focus of them was the earlier 20th century artist named Marsden Hartley, who was born in Lewiston, Maine in 1877, died in Ellsworth, Maine, but through a very successful career established himself as one of the most important American modernist painters of the early 20th century. Maine was also always a very special place to him. He came back here repeatedly to work, beginning in the first decade of the 20th century, and then to the very end of his life in the 1940s. The story of this group of works by Bob Indiana centers around Marsden Hartley's several visits to the city of Berlin, beginning in 1913. Berlin then was a very large, highly sophisticated metropolitan area of some 1 million residents. It had a very vibrant artistic scene, and that is what attracted Hartley to go there. And it was during his second visit, through an artist friend named Arnold Runebeck, that Hartley met Karl von Freiburg, a young man who in 1914 was called into the German military to serve in World War I. And only a few months later, he was killed in action. The connection between Hartley and von Freyburg is based mostly on a series of letters that Hartley wrote. And it's assumed by most scholars that Hartley and von Freyburg were not just friends, but lovers. And for Hartley, von Freyburg's death in World War I was a tragic loss about which he wrote. But he also embarked on several paintings called the Berlin series. And the most important of them by Hartley is this one from 1914 called Portrait of a German Officer. It's one of the many geometric abstractions that Hartley created in these early decades of the 20th century, and which really established himself as a leading figure of the American avant-garde. What's important about this work is really the layers and layers of symbolism that you see in the various geometric images that are depicted there. Near the very top, there is a black and white cross, which is the German cross, a medal given to German soldiers who served with valor or indeed died and were awarded it posthumously. You see in the very bottom right, the number 24, which is the age that von Freyburg was when he was killed in action. And at the lower left, to make clear to the viewer what this painting about, are Karl von Freiburg's initials. There are many other symbols in here which refer to various aspects of Hartley's life. The number 4 is the number of the regiment in which he served in the German army. The connection between Indiana and Hartley came in the 1980s. Bob Indiana moved to the island of Vinalhaven to live year-round in 1978, disembarking, if you will, from the city of New York, where he began his career as an artist, and a place to which he visited long after he moved to Vinalhaven. What Bob saw on his first visit to Vinalhaven in 1968 was this building, the Star of Hope, which was an OddFellows Lodge. The OddFellows, like the Masons, were a fraternal organization whose members served their communities in many ways, but most importantly, assisted each other in all kinds of social, economic, and other connections to support each other. The Star of Hope was a fabulous building and was the place where the members met and held their various ceremonies as part of their membership in the OddFellows Lodge. And the name OddFellows comes from the origins of this group, which go back to late 18th century England, which, like the Masons, came to America in the early part of the 19th century. The Oddfellows were given that name, but because they were members of guilds, they were various craftsmen who were not members of the existing guilds that dominated the economic systems of Europe from the medieval times up until then. They were the Oddfellows who didn't belong to any of these other guilds and who joined together to create this fraternal organization. But this photograph of the Star of Hope, which shows the lodge shortly after it was built, it's a grand example of late Victorian architecture. The Oddfellows had a very specific goal in mind, as this motto makes very clear: to visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan. It's, I think, important to recognize that on an island like Vinalhaven, those who lived there had to be very self-sufficient, even more so from those who were on the mainland. And two of the key industries there were fishing and the granite industry. And that means cutting granite for various building blocks and other architectural purposes. Both of these occupations were dangerous. And one can imagine in the late 19th century, if a fisherman or a granite worker was severely injured or disabled, or worse, dead, it left his family often in dire straits. And what the members of the Oddfellows sought to do was, through their various ways of raising money and through their membership, was to provide financial support for the sick, the distressed, the dead, and the orphans. When Bob arrived there in 1968, this is the building he saw. Still grand in its architectural features, but very worn, to say the least. The OddFellows had disbanded many years before, and Bob recounted seeing this building and simply falling in love with it. And the companion who brought him to the island that first visit was Elegy, a very prominent photographer, photojournalist who did a lot of work for Life magazine and who had a summer cottage on the island. And he bought the building and made it available to Bob, who used it typically in the late summer and early fall as a home and studio. When Elegy died a few years later, Bob eventually bought it from Elegy's estate and then moved in, and that became his home and studio from 1978 until his death in 2018. But to return back to the connection between Hartley and Indiana, it came really as a result of coincidence, which Bob Indiana often described was an inspiration for his work. He learned around 1980 that Marsden Hartley had spent part of a summer in a building across the street from the Star of Hope, as Bob's OddFellows Lodge was originally known, and he began to explore Hartley's work. Hartley enjoyed a very successful career until the 1930s, when, for various reasons, his work was not as attractive and did not sell, and that's when he really moved himself back to Maine on a near full-time basis. And he had been, his reputation had not only fallen, but his visibility in the American art world had largely disappeared. But it was in that early years of the 1980s that the Whitney Museum of American Art did a retrospective of Hartley's work, bringing him back into public and critical attention. So Bob Indiana's discovery of Hartley's very short stay on Vinalhaven happened at an important time when Hartley's work was being looked at with much more rigor than it had previously. So a long story short, Bob Indiana decided to take on the challenge of reinterpreting Marsden Hartley's work around this particular painting of a portrait of a German officer, which was an elegy to Hartley's fallen lover, Karl von Freiburg. And in the series of prints, the correspondences between the two works are very clear. There are so many elements of Hartley's work that Indiana adopts, but he departs from Hartley's model in many ways. As you can see, there's a large circle in the center of Indiana's composition, along with a number of the other symbols that Hartley himself used to honor his fallen friend, Karl von Freiburg. And Indiana makes clear what his sources are through the introduction of these words in that circle. Karl von Freiburg, the man himself, 1914, the year that von Freiburg died, 7 October, when he died. And you see other very similar aspects in Indiana's work that compare with Hartley's work. The German cross in the upper right, 24, the age at which Hartley was killed. But interestingly, in the bottom right of Indiana's silkscreen print are the two letters MH, Marsden Hartley. So Indiana, from the very beginning of this series of 10 prints, makes clear that his work is not only an homage to Hartley's tragic loss of his lover, but also an homage to Hartley himself. There are a number of ways in which Indiana played on this relationship between Hartley and von Freiburg, and what was a growing connection between Indiana himself and Hartley. And again, you'll see a number of symbols here that you've seen before: the German cross, the initials MH for Hartley, KVF for von Freiburg, 24, so on and so forth. The number 4, the regiment of von Freiburg's military career. But the interesting things, again, has to do with words, which Indiana very early in his career began to insert in his paintings and prints, and which became a signature of his work. At the top, Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner. And I'm sure many of you remember this phrase as one of the most memorable aspects of John F. Kennedy's speech in Berlin in the early 1960s. identifying Americans with the still locked down city of Berlin, divided into East and West. But then on the lower part of that circle is another phrase, der amerikanische Maler, which means the American painter. And this is an interesting insertion by Indiana. Hartley described himself late in his life when he returned to Maine as wanting to be the painter of Maine, a claim to which I think he can justifiably be awarded. But Bob Indiana, early in his career, when he had started to adopt words and insert them into compositions, stated that he wanted to be America's great sign painter. And indeed, works like this one from the Hartley Elegies series do appear like signs because of the prominence of words and the graphic elements that make up these hard-edged compositions. Another one of the Hartley Elegies is one that really identifies place and the connections, again, between Indiana and Hartley. Lewiston is where Hartley was born. New York is where both Indiana and Hartley established their careers. Berlin, the place where Hartley met von Freyburg. Ellsworth, the place where Hartley died. And Vinalhaven, the place that Hartley visited briefly in the summer of 1938 and where Indiana made his year-round home in 1978. And you see the dates at the very bottom, 1877, 1943. Those are Marsden Hartley's birth and death dates. There's another connection here through words that wouldn't be obvious to most, but Ellsworth, in addition to being the city in which Hartley died in 1943, was also the first name of Ellsworth Kelly, an artist with whom Indiana became very close in his early years in New York in the late 1950s and 1960s, and it's presumed that they were lovers. This is an identification of another type. Both Hartley and Indiana were gay, and certainly encountered their share of struggles as living as gay men in the early part of the 20th century, and certainly Indiana, born in 1928 and living to 2018, experienced some of the same extraordinary difficulties to make his way in the world in which he was raised and the one in which he chose as his career. One of my favorites from this series of 10 prints is one of the diagonal ones, these diamond-shaped ones. And this is a particularly strong one, I think, in its graphic elements, the simplicity of colors, the boldness of the geometric shapes. But here, for me, in addition to I think the simplicity of the composition, it's the words that he's inserted here. I mean, you see at the bottom, Hartley and von Freiburg, again, identifying the connection between these two men as friends and lovers. At the top, however, you see the words truth, friendship, and love. And you might well ask, well, what does that mean? Does it have something to do with Hartley and von Freiburg's relationship, which was one of friendship and love and truth in the sense that they identified themselves and to each other as gay men. But it has another connection that's very much a part of Bob Indiana's life on Vinalhaven. As I mentioned, he bought and lived in OddFellows Lodge. And another one of their mottos was friendship, love, and truth. These two were elements, ideals, in fact, of the members of the OddFellows in the way they sought to relate with one another and their families through friendship, through love, and through truth. Interesting that Indiana changes them around. It's hard to imagine really what, if there was a specific meaning to this. Compositionally, friendship is the biggest word. It sits at the top, and truth and love on either side of it makes for something of a more balanced composition. And that could well be what Indiana intended in creating this particular image from the Hartley Elegy series. And there's one more that again has to do with place. Lewiston, New York, Berlin, Ellsworth, and Vinalhaven. But it's another variation on the theme, turning the elements of a vertical composition into the diamond shape, and in figuring out different ways to insert the elements that he uses as part of the biography of both himself and Hartley. 1914, again, the year in which von Freyburg died. 1943, the year in which Hartley died. And you see again the German cross, only this time it's tilted. There's really a remarkable variation across the series of 10 prints. And I've often thought about what must have been in Bob Indiana's mind when he set out to create this body of work. The paintings are very similar, but the show that we have at the Farnsworth is focused on these prints. They're very large. They're more than 6 feet high. Indiana is the one who created the compositions, but like any artist of his time, he engaged master printers to do silk screens at this very large scale. So it really is a collaborative enterprise. But the thing that really, I suppose, impresses me and to some degree awes me and to some degree puzzles me is the question of did he conceive of all 10 of these works at once? I mean, they're incredibly complex compositions just for the geometry and the choice of colors. It's hard to know, and I don't, in fact, I think it's not possible to tell whether he envisioned all 10 in the order in which they are given their titles, 1 through 10. But nonetheless, their complexity, their sophistication, their integrity as works of art really reveals Bob Indiana as an artist with an extraordinary visual intellect. It's staggering to think of how one approaches this body of work simply as aesthetic objects. But as I hope I've conveyed, there's also this incredible depth of meaning implied about a series of relationships between Hartley and Indiana, of their lives as gay men, as artists who had to move from place to place to finally settle at the end of their lives in Maine. It's really a very rich narrative, and there are many certainly in the art world who regard this series of prints and paintings by Indiana as one of his great achievements. He began his career in the 1960s, and some 30 years later, he's embarked on this series, taking on as his challenge, reinterpreting Hartley's great painting and expanding it and making it something very much his own. One of the things that I also wanted to share is my experience in working with Bob Indiana. I met him in 2007 when I first came to the Farnsworth when an exhibition of his works from his own collection at the Star of Hope on Vinalhaven was underway. So I spent the next 2 years visiting Bob with my colleague, John Wilmerding, a very prominent scholar of American art, who worked with me together on the show that opened at the Farnsworth in 2009. And this is the place where I visited regularly for a period of about 2 years in order to organize that exhibition. As I said, the Star of Hope was an OddFellows Lodge, and like the Masons, they carried out what to most of us today are very arcane rituals to recognize their members' various achievements and climbing a ladder of those achievements to get increasingly high status in the organization. When Bob took over the Star of Hope in 1978, it was in poor condition. He invested quite a bit of energy and resources to at least stabilize the building. He had it placed on the National Register of Historic Places and began to use it for his home and studio. On 2 floors, the second and third floor are the places where the Oddfellows conducted their ceremonies, where they met, and they were really, these lodges were custom built across the United States to serve those purposes. And this is the 3rd floor where I would say the most arcane of ceremonies took place for the Oddfellows. And you see, as a building, there are painted decorations near the ceiling and on the ceiling. It's a very large space, and you see these throne-like structures at the right and at the left of this image. Those are where the four chief officers of the Oddfellows would sit as these ceremonies were performed. It's an extraordinary building, but what also made it extraordinary was the way in which Bob Indiana filled it with furnishings and his art. I often remember, well, I do remember of my visits out there early on in organizing this exhibition, that I'd come back on the ferry from Vinalhaven, totally exhausted. And after a while, I had to think, well, why am I so worn out after these meetings of an hour or 2 hours doing something I love to do? Well, I realized there were a number of reasons. One was a recognition on my part, somewhat reluctantly, well, that after all, I was working with one of America's great and best known artists, Bob Indiana. I'm not one to have been, let's say, overly awed by celebrity artists, but I just had to recognize that, he was an enormously important figure. I said, well, okay, that's probably part of it. And the second was the incredible visual overload that I experienced in being there. As you see from this image, the Hartley Elegies are on the wall, they're lying on the floor. There are 2 love sculptures and the works for which he is best known throughout the world. And in the back, other early paintings by Bob Indiana and all kinds of other things that Bob had accumulated over his life. This is as personal a statement about an artist's environment as I think exists anywhere. And from time to time, he would move things around. So that it was a kind of constant changing exhibition of his own work in this environment, which was architecturally and its decoration already quite remarkable. You also see a very huge rug on the floor, at least part of it in the lower right corner. That rug was a gift from Louise Nevelson, another important artist of the 50s, 60s, and until her death in the late 1980s. Indiana and Nevelson were friends, and her connections to Rockland were deep. It was where she immigrated as a young girl to join the rest of her family, and where she lived until she married and moved to New York, eventually becoming Louise Nevelson, the great American sculptor whom we know. So there's the entire experience of being out there, as I said, was really visually overwhelming. But there's another part of the story I want to share, because there's a new book out by Bob Indiana, and I'm sure some of you have read about the various legal matters that have arisen since his death. When I met with Bob, sometimes with John Wilmerding, my colleague on this project, or by myself, I realized there was a constant refrain in the conversation I would have with Bob Indiana about the exhibition that I was working on. And it typically went like this. Bob would ask, well, Michael, why are you doing this? Michael, why are you doing that? Michael, why aren't you doing this? And it was pretty much in that tone. And as I said, this was virtually every time that I went to visit Bob. And then near the end of our project, before the exhibition actually was opened, I was out there with John, and we were meeting with Bob one more time to go over various things. And once again, Bob started posing these questions. Michael, why did you do that? Michael, why did you do this? Michael, why didn't you do that? And I don't know what prompted me to do this, but I just sat back and I looked at Bob and I said, Bob, I think I'm finally getting used to your criticisms. And I thought that maybe John Wilmerding was going to be somewhat shocked at what I had just said. I'm not sure he was, but it seemed that way. But then a bit of time passed and Bob leaned back in his chair and smiled at me and said, oh, Michael, I'm full of them. And this was the defining aspect of working with Bob Indiana. Sometimes difficult, And I realized after all, he was placing into my hands an exhibition that would reveal his work from the time he was 6 years old until the most recent examples of his work. And I'm quite sure that any artist enters into that kind of project with some trepidation. The best thing about that interchange with Bob was realizing that I'd established a friendship with him, and some degree from him a sense that he trusted what I was doing. And it made my experience working with Bob Indiana, despite its difficulties that I know many have had, really very rewarding. So it's been my pleasure this afternoon to share with you my reading of Bob Indiana's Hartley Elegies and a little bit about life with Bob Indiana. And with that, I thank you for joining and look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Such a fascinating figure, really. You've given us so much to think about. And I have to say that that Walter Smalling photograph that you showed at the end, which is, you know, as you said, sort of overwhelming and yet very evocative in a sense of, it really looks like he didn't change much at all. And you picture some artist studios that we all know of are really literally blank canvases, and you know,
Yeah.
artists are trying to get that blank atmosphere to work in, but here he was sort of layering and layering.
Yes, and his studio was basically on the ground floor level, and a relatively small one. But he also rented another building on the island called the Sail Loft, which is a place where he could do larger scale works, including sculpture. So the Star of Hope served in part as a studio, as an archive, and a museum of his own work. To me, I think of it as one of the great artist environments in the United States.
And are all the buildings in that area, are they still in existence? I mean, you had mentioned that Marsden Hartley had been across the street at some point, but are all the buildings somewhat intact at this point?
Yes, Vinalhaven's main street is largely intact. There was a great opera house, which was torn down. Also late 19th century kind of building. And it lost a few others on its main street, but it looks pretty much the same. And the Star of Hope, you know, occupies a really important spot in that small village.
Great, thank you. Here, I'm just getting a couple more questions in the Q&A box. If you've got a question, if you could kindly put it in the Q&A box, and then we'll make sure we see it there. Hang on one moment here. I'll see if So let's see, I have one question for you here. When Robert added the Kennedy quote to his art, did he realize that people in Berlin were calling himself a jelly donut?
Yes, a Berliner. I'm not sure they did. And if they did, I think they read it in a very much more high manner as to what Kennedy has said. I mean, that was 1962, I believe, you know, not that long after the creation of the Berlin Wall. As a graduate student in the mid 70s, I lived in Berlin for a while, and, you know, it was much later, of course, than when Kennedy was there, but it was a bizarre place to live because of the division between these, the West being the showpiece of capitalism and democracy, and the East being the showplace of socialism. It was a very strange place. But when Hartley was there, it was an incredibly vibrant artistic center.
Question with a sense of humor, so that's a good one. Let's see. Here's a question about Indiana's most important legacy. I mean, certainly we've heard so many sort of big names in the pop world of pop art. And really, what do you think people will remember most about his work?
Well, for better or worse, his love is one of the best known works and artworks in the world, even though many people who recognize it may not know the name of the artist who created it. For Bob, that was a bit of of tremendous value, and at the same time a distraction from the depth of his work. he admitted, as did others of his generation, that the name pop really didn't fit. It was applied by a critic. The group, loosely affiliated as they were given other names also, but pop is the one that stuck, and Andy Warhol being perhaps the one who's best remembered. But works by Warhol and Rosenquist and Ed Ruscha, Roy Lichtenstein, they were much more critiques of popular culture, hence the name pop art. But Indiana's work always had much greater depth in its intent. I mean, even love has a sort of powerful fundamental basis. I mean, love is an emotion that we all hope to feel, often in many ways, and certainly with more than one person in our lives. But for Bob Indiana, it had a special meaning. He grew up in the Church of the Christian Scientists, I think largely through his grandmother, where in the churches of the Christian Scientists, there was a phrase, "God is love." And that phrase stuck with Bob. And as was so often the case, he mined these aspects of his own life, whether from coincidence or familiarity, to create the art that he did. So love is something that, as much as it is a widespread aspect of human life, it's also profoundly personal. And the Hartley Elegies is an exploration of love in one way. But his work has this, I suppose, intellectual depth through the insertion of words in his images that really separates it from most of pop art. And the recent exhibition, retrospective of his exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art, really revealed this great breadth and productivity and fertility of ideas that he enjoyed for at least 3 decades in his life. And that's quite a remarkable achievement. I think many artists of that generation are being rediscovered by scholars and critics. So the legacy, I guess we'll wait and see a bit on that, but there's no question he's one of the most important figures of his generation.
Certainly lots to think about. And as you said, I think he's also just being discovered by the public anew too. They're refamiliarizing themselves with his works. And here's a question, actually, something that I had in the back of my mind, so I'm glad somebody's asking it. Could you share your perspective on the parallels between the Hartley Elegies and how he engaged Demuth's figure number 5?
Oh, Charles Demuth, or Demuth, it's said both ways. Another important figure of early 20th century American modernism. Yes, Bob Indiana drew upon Charles Demuth's painting incorporating the number 5, and again, read its symbols and then transformed it into a painting with a meaning that really is of his own. Indiana, like many great artists, also mines the work of others. Some were before him, as in the case of Hartley and Demuth, but sometimes they're contemporaries. I suppose, it's a commonplace thing, and that ability that Indiana exhibits through borrowing from both Charles Demuth and Marsden Hartley is another demonstration of, I think, his intellectual rigor and curiosity. Looking at things around him, whether from his personal life or from the wider American art world that he joined in the 1950s. It provided him with a rich subject matter to explore.
Thank you very much, Michael. Let's see if we have time for a couple more questions here. Let me just see if I can. So are the elegies all together in one place now? If so, where may I see them? And that may have been in the lecture, but I think the question is, my guess is probably about the paintings.
The paintings, well, let me answer about the prints. There was an edition of 50 with a number of other artist proofs and museum proofs, and they exist in other museum collections. And, we acquired ours shortly after we organized the exhibition in 2009. So they exist in museum collections. And because they're works on paper, they don't often get exhibited. So we were very happy to be able to show them again, as we did in 2009. The paintings, as I understand it, are owned by the Morgan Art Foundation, which was an organization that Bob Indiana involved himself with in the 1990s, I think. So I guess you would say that they're in private hands. They were shown in an exhibition along with the prints. Oh God, when would that have been? Probably late 1980s, no, it would have had to been the early 1990s, an exhibition that traveled around the United States. And I saw them. And little did I know the close connection I would develop with that body of work and with Bob Indiana. So the 18 paintings are similar on subject matter, but they also include one group of paintings that are in a different format. They're round, so-called tondos. So they're the vertical Hartley Elegy paintings, the diamond-shaped ones, and the round ones. And that's an interesting thing too, that Indiana's exploring this, not just the subject matter, but also the shape of the paintings themselves, which is very much something that arises out of the pop art generation. Frank Stella and others were experimenting with shaped canvases. Indiana brought a different kind of rigor to it. Again, the idea of doing 18 paintings and 10 prints on the same subject matter, that's extremely rare. And as I hope I indicated, the challenge that it posed Indiana to create this body of work that's connected, yet each individual work can stand on its own.
So would you say, in terms of value for educational purposes or sort of for public audience, in a sense, to be able to see them all together, if we're conceiving that he was thinking about them or perhaps even working on them all at once, then to see them together is really the way that they're meant to be seen?
Yep, I think so. And it would be a lovely thing to recreate that exhibition, to see them all together. Maybe it's possible.
Just going to see if I've got any other questions for you. Any other hidden stories you can share with us about the exhibition of the Hartley Elegies, or any other sort of public reactions sometimes they have conveyed?
I can't say that I know anything about public reaction to the Hartley Elegies. I do know that the Indiana show, when we organized it in 2009, was one of our most heavily visited shows. And it was one of the other parts of that show that was so rewarding to do, had to do with a work by Bob done in 1964 called Eat. And those of you who are familiar with the Farnsworth will remember that 20-foot by 20-foot sculpture consisting of 5 painted metal discs and flashing lights with the letters EAT appeared on the roof of the Farnsworth for a number of years after 2009, when that show took place. It was created in 1964 as a commission awarded by Philip Johnson, the renowned American architect, who was charged with the design and decoration of the New York State Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing. There were works by some of Bob's contemporaries also on the facade of that round concrete building. And Bob created that. As I mentioned earlier, he conceived of himself as the great American sign painter. So you might wonder, EAT, these letters with flashing lights going on, what was that about? Many of the early fairgoers thought that sign indicated that there was a restaurant in the New York State Pavilion, which there wasn't. And lines of people formed to get something to eat. Very soon after, the officials at the fair turned the lights off to, reduce the attention that sculpture was getting among the throngs of fairgoers. I was at the fair in 1964. I was 13 years old. I don't remember seeing Eat, but I do remember, the experience of being at that remarkable kind of futuristic World's Fair. But Eat is a word, of course, that we identify with as the thing that all of us have to do to live. And indeed, that's part of its meaning. But the creation of that work for Bob came about once again through, circumstances of his personal life. He joined the Army in the early 1950s. I'm quite sure to take advantage of being able to get on the GI Bill after he served. He was a sergeant. He was assigned to a post in Anchorage, Alaska, a pretty distant place in that time period. And while there, he received a message from home that his mother was dying and that he should get back there as quickly as he could, which he did. Again, personal, the details of Bob's life are important always, but in this case as well. He was adopted at birth. He never knew his birth parents. His adoptive parents divorced when he was 8, and he lived mostly with his mother, sometimes with his father. They both remarried. So he had a very fractured childhood, and his mother, as is sometimes described, was moved frequently, always looking for a place where the grass was greener. But he grew up in frankly, you have to recognize it, a very dysfunctional family situation. He moved something like 17 times by the time he was 21 years old, and it's really hard to get your head around what that would mean to a boy going to school, knowing after a while he wouldn't be there long, he wouldn't be able to keep friends, and having no other family besides his mother and father, adoptive mother and father, and then divorced mother and father, adoptive mother and father. That's a traumatic childhood. But he lived with his mother mostly, and he had a great fondness and love for her. Coming back to this particular instance, when he was informed in Anchorage that his mother was dying, he got back to Indiana, where she was living at the time, and arrived to discover her in very dire condition, wasting away from cancer. And from her sort of sleep-like condition, she woke up to see her son, who I'm sure she hadn't seen for quite a number of months, if not a couple of years. And she looked up to him and said, as Bob recorded, "Have you had anything to eat?" And those were the last words she spoke to him before she died. So the use of the word "eat" on this sculpture is a visual recreation of this powerful memory of a truly tragic moment in his life. And as with love, Bob's work often is profoundly universal. We all eat, we all seek love, but it's deeply personal at the same time. And I think that's one of his great achievements and gifts as an artist. The rewarding part of this part of doing the exhibition with Bob is that the Eat sculpture came back to Bob when the fair closed and had never been shown before. So when I saw it in the sale loft in the basement, I said, we've got to find a way to show this thing. And I think Bob was a bit skeptical. But what we did is we commissioned an engineering firm to figure out how to install the structure safely on the roof. It's heavy. It was mounted on a round concrete building, which is a very different thing than being on the open air on the roof of the Farnsworth along the coast of Maine. But we managed to do it. So there was a presentation in the Strand Theater just before the show opened, fully attended, a wonderful film made by Dale Shearholt, an interview with Bob, which we still have available in the museum store. It's really very revealing about who Bobby Indiana is. But those of us who were around that June remember it rained every day for a month. It was miserable. And it was that day. And the plan was to lead Bob out of the Strand Theater when all of the program was done. And as he came out, there was a swarm of people behind us, and a signal was given, and they lighted the sign. It was the first time Bob had never seen it lighted at the fair. It was shut off before he got to the fair. So it was a thrill for all of us. But Bob Indiana turned to me and said, Michael, I never thought I would ever see this in my life. And to be able to do that was a great feeling, and still is. I feel very happy to have been able to work with Bob Indiana on that show, and at times to have to sustain his annoying questions over and over again. But that was Bob Indiana.
Well, he sounds really like a remarkable figure. And I really just thank you, Michael, for your time today and bringing the story of Robert Indiana to the public and to all of our visitors today. And, I think that's a perfect note to end our lecture on. And again, I really want to thank everyone for joining us virtually. And we have lots of talks coming up as well. In fact, a couple of weeks from now, we have a talk on George Tice, given from our registrar, Angela Waldron, and we have many other events coming up as well. So we hope we'll see you in the gallery soon, if not virtually. So thank you very much.